Um, I'm really thrilled to be here today to open the panel. My name is John Floretta. I'm the Global Deputy Executive Director at JPAL. And this is part of the Scale Up community of practice. And so the Scale Up COP was founded 6 years ago by Larry Kush, who's here today, and Johannes Lin. And the purpose of the COP is to provide a platform for knowledge exchange among experts and practitioners on approaches to scaling up development interventions, for developing partnerships, and for championing the idea of scaling up and systems change. And in 6 years, we now have over 700 members from 200 institutions. And the way we're structured is in 9 sectoral and thematic working groups. So Larry and I chair the M&E working group. And the COP, we have an annual meeting, which is usually in DC in person. And last year and again this year, we are doing it virtually. So I'll add to the chat in just a moment some information if you want to register for the community of practice to make sure you're getting our emails and invitations to the annual meeting. I'll add a link, or Natalie, if you were online, if you could add a link now, that would be amazing. So in the M&E working group, we normally do 4 to 5 webinar sessions a year. And this year, Larry and I thought we wanted to focus on institutionalization. And what we mean by that, as like a framework for thinking about scale up. And so what we mean by that is like broadly defined, models and partnerships between NGOs and other civil society or academic institutions on one hand, and collaborating with governments on the other hand, to contextualize and scale models which in many cases, were originated by the NGOs. And so a classic example, which we'll speak to a little bit of this, is the work of Pratham and Teaching at the Right Level was, kind of the originator of the model, and then has been collaborating to build that model into government systems in India and also through other partners in Africa. So this has been a promise of civil society and NGOs, is like to be focusing on R&D and innovation, helping to develop ideas that could be proven in pilots and shown to be cost effective and drive impact. But they're going to be islands of excellence unless they are really then turned to collaborations to help build them with governments into their systems, contextualize them, scale them, and sustain them. And so that's the process of institutionalization that we're referring to. And so I wouldn't say the norm in international development. There's been real successes in the last several years. And so in this M&E working group, we decided to highlight on some of those successes in collaboration with the health working group and the education working group. So in the education working group, on our first webinar, we focused on a collaboration that Young Love has with the government of Botswana to institutionalize and to track teaching at the right level into primary schools in Botswana. We looked at Educate's work embedding a skills model with the government of Rwanda. Our second webinar was on the same institutional theme, but with the health sector. So we had Living Goods and Last Mile Health talk about their work building community health workers into regular practices with government collaboration in many countries in Africa. And so we have 2 final sessions of the series. And so this session, we wanted to cover different perspectives from donor communities. And so, a lot of times I think people write proposals or they have ideas for partnerships and they say, and if this works, the government will scale it up. But like what are donors and what are people who are in charge of partnership development, what have they seen for how to tell whether this institutional process is really happening, and what can we learn from the experiences of the different organizations that they collaborate with. So we have an amazing panel, which I'm very awed by and very happy to have today. I'll do a quick introduction and then I'll pass over to Larry shortly. So in order of last name, we have Jo Bourne, who's the Chief Technical Officer at the Global Partnership for Education. Her role is to drive quality policy, strategy, and program development, as well as rigorous monitoring and evaluation of GPE-supported programs. She was previously, among many other roles, UNICEF's Global Chief for Education. We have Angela Gichaga, who's the CEO for the Financing Alliance for Health. And the Financing Alliance for Health is a partnership that works with governments on financing strategies for primary and community health systems that operate at scale. And so I think this will connect a lot to the second webinar session we had with Last Mile Health and with Living Goods. She has an amazing background. She's trained as a physician. She's worked in public sector and management. She's launched NGOs. She's been a consultant. So she brings a broad set of diverse experiences to this conversation. Rachel Hinton is the Senior Social Development Advisor at FCDO, which is the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office at the UK. She's had a long tenure in education, working with DFID and FCDO for years, and leading the education team at the Research and Evidence Division. You know, a lot of Rachel's work is focused exactly on this issue of partnering with governments to incorporate learning and research from around the world and scale evidence-based programs. And Varia Liposek is the Director of Learning, Monitoring, and Evaluation at Co-Impact. I'm sure she'll say a few more words about Co-Impact, but it's a donor collaborative, philanthropic collaborative, I should say, which is helping to invest in systems change and has supported teaching at the right level work and some of the community health work by Last Mile Health. Previous to her role at Co-Impact, she was a research scientist and a practitioner in residence at MIT's Governance Lab. She, before that, was with Twaweza in East Africa, and she brings 2 decades of experience in organizational learning with civil society and public sector initiatives. And all of this, these 4 amazing specialists will be brought into conversation by Larry Cooley, who is the founder of the Community of Practice with Johannes, is the chair of the Monitoring and Evaluation Working Group, and has himself a very long career in international development, including as president of MSI. So one thing before we launch is we want to get a sense of who is in the audience. We have 70 participants, which is great. So Natalie, can you put the 2 questions that we ask up just to get a sense of who the different participants are and whether they've involved in the community of practice or in what sectors they might and background they might come from? Can you put that up for me? I don't see it on my end, but I'm still learning about MS Teams. You know what? It's okay if it's not there on the tip of your fingers, Natalie. We can go ahead and go directly into the session. I don't want to delay any longer. So I'm going to say we have a few additional dates I'll mention in the close. Well, we have our 4th session with government coming at the end of October, on October 29th. And then we have on November 8th and November 17th, as part of our annual Community of Practice meetings, 2 sessions, one on institutionalization and systems and scaling change, and a monitoring and evaluation breakout, which I'll say more about later. But for now, without further ado, Larry, I'm going to pass it over to you to run the session with our 4 esteemed panelists.
Thank you, and I consider myself very lucky to be doing this. It's not only a distinguished panel. I've now had a chance, a couple of them I've known for a long time, a couple of them I'm meeting for the first time, but I promise you, everyone who's on the line, you're in for a big treat. This is not only a very knowledgeable panel, it's an incredibly delightful panel. And the tone we've decided to take for this conversation is as if we were letting the rest of you into our living room. So we're going to have this conversation as intimately and as candidly as we can muster on this, and the rest of you are welcome to listen in, but for the first part, we're going to be talking to each other. And then as time goes on, we're going to try to take as many of your questions or comments as we can. So I encourage you as we go along to put any comments you might have or questions into the chat box. John's going to be monitoring those, and after I have a chance to interact for a little while with the panelists, he's going to feed in some of the questions or comments that happen to come in through the chat box. Before I jump right in, I want to say just a word or two more about why we picked this topic. And if you think about the issue of scaling from an M&E point of view, our first year as a working group, we focused on the issue of scalability, which is how can you build scale into the maximum extent possible from the beginning. And I felt like we made a lot of progress on that issue. And part of what came out of that was realizing that when you're actually in the act of scaling, there are at least three kinds of evidence that are super important. One has to do with continuing to look at coverage. Are you reaching the people that you're trying to reach? And I would say, in general, the community of which we're a part has gotten quite good at that. Tracking of coverage across some concept of what the group at need might happen to be. The second is efficacy. I'd say we're not quite as good at that. In fact, I'm probably being generous. I think we're still not very good at that, but we're better at that than we are at the third issue. And the third issue is what we're calling institutionalization, which is if these things started outside of government or they started in some little corner of government, how would we know? And how would we know in time to make changes, whether they were really finding their way into the center, whether they're becoming the new normal? So that's the issue that the working group decided to focus on this year. That's the issue we're focusing on today. And we want to focus on it particularly today from the point of view of donors. Now, we have a particularly, I think, interesting panel because several of the individuals on the panel have not only been donors, they've been on the other side of the street. And in addition, some of them currently stand right in the middle of the bridge that's supposed to connect donors with governments. But I want them, to the extent possible today, to think from the donor side and say, what does it look like when you're on that side, and how is that informed by maybe the experience, not only of doing it, but the experience you which is how do we do the best possible job tracking those sorts of things and using that information to improve our practice as we go. Let me start, Joe, with you. I think probably most people know GPE, but maybe you could say just a word or two. I think particularly a constituency model of your board, which is for me a very relevant and interesting thing, and also how you think about the role of GPE in trying to promote government adoption of innovation intervention. Go ahead.
Thanks, Larry. That's a huge question, but yeah, that was exactly the first point I was going to make. So, you know, for those of you who know GPE, those of you who don't, we're a partnership and a fund. We're focused exclusively on quality education for children in lower income countries. But as Larry said, we have a multi-stakeholder partnership. Our board level has constituencies from civil societies, from governments, from bilateral donors, from private sector. I'm sure I've missed a few. But that is also replicated at country level under the leadership of government. So a very important part of, you know, what we do is under the leadership of government, and actually in only a couple of countries do we not work under the leadership of government directly, and those are countries, you know, Syria being one where we're actually unable to work work directly with the government. So we're different from a sort of a bilateral donor in that respect. The bilateral donors sit on our board, but more importantly, so do ministers of education, and they have a very specific voice on our board. And I was kind of interested when you know, the word institutionalization, we've just done a new strategy, that word does not come up once, it doesn't feature. And so I thought, well, you know, what does it mean? It means about, to, as you said, to make an activity or a practice like a norm. And that's not where we start from necessarily in terms of, you know, making a project a norm, making something that's outside government institutionalized within government. But what we do have a lot of experience at is actually working with government in institutionalizing practices. We've got a couple of decades of experiences around working with governments on, you know, how to have good sector plans, how to do budgeting, all of the sort of foundational pieces that a sector might need, including the sort of joint monitoring, participatory country dialogues around the education sector, those big foundations. But the challenge that we've had now and our new strategy tackles is that our ministers said very clearly to us, we want to now focus on delivery at scale through systems. And that was a really important point. So impact at scale through systems. So much of what I might talk about later on is how we've navigated thinking about systems, how they're complex, how you drive change through systems and bring actors together. But, you know, much of what I'll stop now, is the partnership, the power of the partnership, delivery at scale, and also adapting and learning. So those are the three sort of buckets that I might touch upon.
Perfect. Rachel, why don't you pick up the storyline there? I don't think FCDO needs an introduction, but why don't you say a little bit about how the education group, not only your own, but the education group in general, looks at this issue of systems change, adoption by government, and the role of donors?
Thank you very much, Larry. So I think at FCDO, we've recognised that the kind of whole challenge of learning needs us to have a response that isn't just about parallel bilateral funding, but is very much about working at the heart of government, and that the domestic spend is going to be far more important, and ensuring that those policies are really focused in on foundational skills and where the evidence says we're going to have the biggest impact. So I have both the privilege and the responsibility of looking and thinking about new research programs, including how we gather evidence. And I'm sure your listeners will know many of them. The RISE program, for example, is absolutely focused around this question that Joe mentioned of system change and what elements of the system work, and in particular, developing a very exciting new accountability model. Accountability, we feel, is a really important critical factor here. In fact, this week is the RISE conference, so Lance Pritchett, who leads that, we have a principle of everything being open access so that we can institutionalize and build capability, and part of that is making material data evidence available to everybody, so any of you can join that conference. It's free of charge. And two other big programs that we are working on that really tackle this issue is the Deliver Ed program, looking at how data is used by governments to track their own indicators of progress. And it's about looking at how capability and where in government that capability sits. Is it in the Ministry of Education, or is it indeed in the Ministry of Finance, or indeed nationally in, say, a cabinet office? So we're looking at some of those questions about institutionalization will require that interplay of other parts of the government system.
And then that one quite in particular. Thanks.
Sure. And just finally, the last program to mention is the Education Technology Hub, that is a partnership with the bank and with Gates Foundation and others. And I think there's some really exciting lessons coming out of that. Thanks, Larry.
Thank you. Angela, you sit as probably more than anyone else on the panel, right exactly on that bridge between governments and donors, and particularly as it relates to health, and even more particularly, one of the issues we've been looking at in this series, community health workers. Could you pick up the storyline a little bit from your point of view?
Thanks, Larry and John. And as you said, even though we are not a donor, as our name suggests, we do facilitate across the bridge. So just to build on the introduction, the Financing Alliance for Health is a government advisory firm that exclusively supports mainly ministries of health and finance across Africa, with their primary and community health financing strategy so that they can institutionalize at-scale community health systems. So we, as Larry said, we act as that bridge and facilitator between the government and the non-state players and other key funding and implementing partners. What my team and I do is we support governments to scale up effective models of delivery by increasing both domestic and other funding towards integrated community health systems. That's reducing the fragmentation that actually happens within the particular ecosystem. So really excited about this conversation around institutionalization and, the fact that, from our learning, institutionalization is not a process. It's a process, it's not an event rather, and it's a spectrum rather than binary. So it's not that you are institutionalized or not, but rather to what extent has institutionalization happened in a country. And I'm hoping that at some point on this call, we'll be able to share some of our metrics and how we track institutionalization with our work. And then also thinking about if institutionalization is not linear, what are those circular metrics that can be used to assess institutionalization, and then what happens with the subjective, non-quantifiable aspects of institutionalization that actually exist. So outside something that you can actually quantify, how do you actually talk about trust and access and other non-subjective, non-quantifiable aspects? So thanks, Larry.
That's great. By the way, we lost your video, Angelos. Bring yourself back. Varya, I think probably most people know co-impact, but maybe you could say a word or two about that in starting, and then again, pick up this story about how you approach this issue, how you see your own role vis-a-vis this issue of government adoption.
Yeah, thanks, Larry. It's really lovely to be here. So Co-Impact is a donor collaborative. So we're a pretty young philanthropy donor collaborative. And our whole objective is to support program partners, so organizations that are rooted in the context where they're working in the Global South, to achieve what I think somebody else already talked about in terms of impact at scale, right? And to do so sustainably, we believe that it has to be done through the systems that have the mandate, particularly when we're talking about public sector. So we we support program partners that work in the sectors of education, health, social security, income, and so on. So basically the whole kind of backbone of Co-Impact is trying to get program partners, so organizations who are in these contexts, in these settings, to the point of where they can both work with government and with the systems, but also through their work, enable the government, the systems to think about how is this becoming part of our own system, our functions, kind of from the very top level in terms of how do we get something mandated as sort of the policy level to the very granular, what does that look like when through the capillaries of the system? How does that actually look like? What does it actually look like when these things get implemented? And so my role as somebody who's looking at sort of learning, measurement, evaluation really is to kind of think about how do we support our program partners to think this way? Well, actually, most of them already think this way, but how do we support them to actually up their game, if you will, in order to really be able to work further with government, and to how do they then support governments to adopt some of these functions? So how do you learn? How do you evaluate? How do you generate data that you as a government are vested in and are going to use? I'll stop here in brief, but I'm sure we'll get into these topics more.
That's great. I'm going to make an editorial comment here just for a second, which is that there's been a tremendous amount of rhetoric in the community about the system change and government adoption and so on. My opinion is it's still a huge gap between the rhetoric and the reality on this, in the sense that we speak on behalf of governments very often, not necessarily the government speaking on their own behalf on this. We develop information systems that are outside government with the intention of influencing government. We fund things through projects with the intention that they're going to move government systems, and sometimes they do, but frequently they don't. And so I'm hoping as we go deeper on this, we'll not only look at some of the promise, but some of the peril in this, and look at what's responsible for the gap between the aspiration and the results, sometimes in terms of the effective use of monitoring and evaluation to really help drive and support the process. I don't anymore suspect the intention. I think the intentionality is very strong now on the donor side, but I think we still have a performance problem ourselves in terms of trying to truly be part of the solution. And the reason we chose the four of you for this is I think you really are at the cutting edge of this, and even there's work to be done. So I want to try to push a little bit further, not so much on how you see institutionalization, but how you assess it in your own minds. We're going to turn in a second to how that relates to or conforms with or even empowers the government's own assessment of the process. But when you're thinking about the extent to which institutionalization or incorporation into government is or is not happening, what do you look at? And this time I'm gonna work backwards. I'm gonna go to you, Varya, first on this, and ask whether there are specific indicators. You have a model, a methodology. If not, or in addition, are there kind of informal things you look at relating that maybe to your experience with HOESA before? I mean, what is it, if you were at Co-Impact, that would tell you we are or we are not, or there is not major progress in something getting incorporated into government systems?
Yeah, thanks, Larry. That's such a great question. So what we do at Co-Impact is that we help program partners to develop what we call system level outcomes, right? And so we have some sort of a framework for this, and I think frameworks are really useful because most systems, especially public systems, have a very similar set of sort of functions and components. And so frameworks, not unlike the one I think that you shared at some point in an earlier session, I think there's a toolkit for it, right? So frameworks are super useful as sort of at some level, so that you don't always start with the kind of a blank page as to how do you understand where the problem is within the system, and then how might you then envision what does it look like when the system is performing better. And so this is what we call system level outcomes, right? And so we work with our program partners to set outcomes, not of what they themselves will achieve, although that's also important, but what does it look like when a program is functioning, when a system is functioning better? And so what does it look like within the system? What does it look like, right? And so you would go through a process guided by a framework that would allow you to look at certain formal, but also really importantly, informal things. And this is what we've learned actually through a lot of our practice, is that the formal things are the ones that we're all familiar with. You know, are there frameworks, are there mandates, are there financial flows, human resources, accountability lines? These are things that are, we're kind of familiar with. But overlaid into that and kind of integrated into that are the informal things: power structure, incentive, motivations, relationships, etc. And so to be able to articulate, so our mandate, the way we see it, is to work with program partners to articulate what does it look like when a particular component or a function of the system is performing better. And so again, you can have a framework that guides that thinking because that's super helpful, but the actual details of what that looks like have got to be context specific. And so maybe I want to end on this line, is that I think doing a lot of this work involves this really interesting zooming in and out, to where at a higher level, it's good to learn across and use frameworks, etc. But at the very specific level of a system you're trying to change, it has got to be really contextual and tailored to that particular setting.
That's an absolutely perfect segue to you, Angela. Why don't you pick up on the conversation you and I were having yesterday on exactly this point?
And I really love where Varya has ended, because the truth is, one, institutionalization is a process and not an event. And so for us, how we track institutionalization is also identifying that process metrics are valid milestones, and to her point, you need to keep zooming in and out between contribution and attribution and contribution and attribution, because that's a mindset that you come to systems changes, but it's a very different mindset when you are actually working with projects. I think the second thing is around the spectrum rather than the binary, and I mentioned this earlier. we believe that institutionalization is a spectrum. It's not that you either have it or not, right? It's to what extent. And if I can share now, Larry, something that we do as an entity, because we work at institutionalizing community health systems in government, we assess different levels of institutionalization. So the first thing is, is there a conducive policy and system environment for that particular initiative, right? And that is everything from, was that solution actually demand driven or provided? How are there champions in the systems? Are we having the community health systems actually included in the policy frameworks, either parliamentary bills or government documents? Just a conducive policy and system environment in itself is a step in institutionalization. I think most people just want to have a fully government-funded, on-budget program that is, run by the government. But the truth is, so many countries start at very many different points, and not everyone will get there at the same time, right? So the conducive environment is very important. Then the second one is, in-kind and non-monetary support. And I think this is something that many partners actually overlook very strongly. They say if the government is not putting in some skin in the game, then they're not bought in. I think that's a very oversimplistic comment because, again, governments are starting from a very different point of view. Something as having the government appointing a focal person or a dedicated team or unit alongside this partner to implement, we have to always keep reminding ourselves, governments do have limited resources, including human resources and time resources, and they're quite stretched. The fact that they're actually putting someone to work on a particular program is also indicative of their interest and prioritization of this activity. Even other shared services, project vehicles, office equipment, again, overlooked and underestimated, but actually quite crucial. The third part of the spectrum is, a secured budget line, even though it is not funded. And I know this is something we are always having challenges with people say, okay, there's a budget line, but it's not yet funded. It is really hard to first secure a budget line on government budgets, but it is an indication that at some point the government is intentional about meeting the costs, and we cannot underestimate what that means. It also is an indication that governments are proactively engaging others to come along the budget, the journey. And then the last thing is, do we actually have a funded budget line? So sometimes people are like, oh yes, this is the silver bullet. We have a budget line, we are good to go. But actually, it's not just about having a secured budget line. Is that budget line consistently funded, and is that funding increasing over time, right? Again, institutionalization is not just an event, it's a process, and it's something that's tracked over time. I also wanted to mention something that Varia actually mentioned as well, is that, there are some hard to quantify aspects of institutionalization that are usually overseen, and they're actually quite necessary, even though not sufficient. How do we, as Varia mentioned, how do we assess relationships and the strength of relationships? How do we assess trust and access and capacity of government? And, I think they are quite key and are often overlooked. And for us as a team, it's something that we actually deliberately track over time. And then the last point around institutionalization is that this idea that it's not linear. We always assume governments start with a plan, and then people, and then budget, and then the program is scaled down. We have so many examples where governments have been running programs that have not yet been articulated in any policy. We have so many examples where money was given and the government deprioritized an intervention, right? So we have this idea that the steps are linear and they go in a particular order, but the truth is that systems change, and especially where the government is concerned, it's not linear. So circular metrics, what we refer as circular metrics rather, is actually understanding that the government can start at any point of that, but we'll have to go through all the steps for it to be relevant. So thank you so much, Varia. You really set it very well as well.
Before I come to you, Rachel, on this, I want to just insert a request. The first is that I suspect there are many of you on the call, and certainly the four of you who are speaking as panelists, who've got documentation on aspects of what you're either doing or saying on this. And I think a real service the community of practice could provide is to accumulate some of those things, maybe curate it a little bit, but mostly make it available to people. So any of you who have things, and I'm including the four who are speaking today, but not exclusively the four who are speaking today. Any of you have things that you think might be methodologically helpful on this, either case studies or written up methodologies or articulated approaches, please send them in to John and myself, and we'll find some way to put this to good use for the benefit of all of us. And anyone who's not a member of the community of practice, just stay tuned to the website. I'm not exactly sure what we'll do with this. It depends on what we get, but we promise to do something with it. So if people would send things in. The other comment I'll make before I turn to you, Rachel, on this is that I've had occasion to work on several of these sets of metrics and indicators, methodologies for tracking institutionalization, and to look at quite a few others. And what I can tell you is that they have a family resemblance to one another. There are quite a number of them, but some of them are further along than others. Some do a better job of integrating these less structured elements than others, but they all have a couple of characteristics. One of which is they all require contextualization. A second of which is they all, at least the ones that I'm most familiar with, are a kind of a maturity model. They have some progression over time in things so that you're watching how something evolves over time. And third, they almost all benefit from some sort of a participatory process because they're not entirely objective metrics where you could just have an expert go in and do a study. There's some element of self-assessment that's involved in the ones that I'm familiar with. So I think if we can, as a community, begin to accumulate not just our lessons, but examples on this thing, we'll not only, I think, feel like misery has company on this, but we can actually take a step together collectively on this. Rachel, let me go to you next on this.
Thanks. And talking about sharing, I'd love, Angela, I'd love to see how you measure trust. Your last point, if you have a document for that, please do share it. So Larry, there were three things I wanted to pick up on. First was, Angela, you talking about the kind of critical dimension of having an individual, someone responsible for taking things forward. And I think what that makes me feel is that actually as donors, we need to do a better job in coordinating what we're expecting or wanting governments to scale. Because at the moment, I feel that we're fragmenting and going in as individuals with different requests to institutions that are already overstretched. So I think there's a real question. I mean, the Global Education Experts Advisory Panel was put out its first report, the Smart Eyes report, in order to help, if you like, us come to some agreement about what we think works and what doesn't. That was a first report, and it's limited by existing research and evidence, and it needs to have many more studies in there. But the aim of that was to help overstretched governments with choices, difficult choices about, including about what to scale. My second point is, I think I try to be self-reflexive, and I think one of the things that I think we haven't done well enough was when, at the time, DFID supported the World Bank and the SABER tools. Now, I think the SABER tools, which were systems tools, are a brilliant set of tools. But we spent much too much time, I think, focusing about looking at policies rather than actually implementation of those policies. And we know there's a huge gap between policy or even policy intent and actually what we're doing. And the predictor of whether something will be institutionalized isn't what the policy might be, but it's about what's actually happening now. That's a much better predictor of the future. So I think there's a lesson that I feel in our institution we need to learn on that. And then thirdly, just to give a quick snapshot into a program that I feel is a really impressive initiative in Ghana, the Complementary Basic Education Initiative. That's a 9-month catch-up class for children who are out of school, getting them back into schooling. And we looked at this program that's now been going on for a long time. It was civil society started this initiative. And we looked at how was it that it became really scaled in a very big way with lots of different civil society organizations. many different funders coming in on board, and a really positive collaboration between government and civil society working together to deliver this program. And basically, there were 4 key pillars, if you like, working together: the donors, the researchers, civil society, and government. And what we saw was each of those, if you like, I call them silos. Each of them had institutional incentives to work within their own system and not incentives to work between them. And so, you know, one of the big challenges is how do you create incentives for both the formal relationships between those pillars, but also the informal ones. And we did, you know, when we were doing the research, we, as you said, Larry, it was, you know, some subjective, if you like, participatory approaches to ask for ratings of the strength of those relationships between them. And although, you know, certainly it's not, you know, it's not your quantitative science, it was very revealing. Thank you.
I can't think of a better setup for you, Joe, than what Rachel was just saying. What exactly build on where she left off, if you wouldn't mind.
You know, I've listened to everybody, including where you started, Larry, and there are so many sort of resonant points that I could pick up on, including what Rachel's just said. And I was trying to think about, you know, what you said at the beginning, and then some of the other points that people were making about how you measure some of these more difficult things. So you said at the beginning, you know, one of the biggest challenges around all the system change and systems thinking is really how do you operationalize it? How do you put that into practice? And we've spent probably the best part of a year trying to actually tackle that, because there's so much good thinking out there about systems, but how do you use all the assets that GP brings as a partnership to go, okay, well, what does that mean in practice? And so, you know, we looked at a lot of system thinking at RISE, at the delivery work, examples from Tanzania and Ghana, you know, and Pakistan and others, trying to think about, well, what's the kind of pathway around systems change? And then how do you sort of operationalize that, including thinking about measuring whether you're actually making progress along that pathway. So the first point I wanted to make has already been said. It's not linear, obviously, so I can talk about a pathway, but it's not a linear pathway. It will have many twists and turns. But to try to operationalize it, we needed to try and put some kind of, I guess, critical pathway language around it. So we've talked, there are so many different methodologies around this, but we've talked in how we've tried to think it through as there being about sort of six areas. One being, you know, assessing the situation on the ground, assess, prioritize, very much, you know, what's the reform that the government wants to move the dial on in this particular context? Is it improving foundational literacy? Is it dramatically improving the quality and reach of early childhood? But that's a government-led decision with partners on the ground. Diagnose what are the different obstacles to doing that particular reform, and I think I'm not sure who talked about those are the micro as well as the macro. So if you're thinking about improving teachers impacting classrooms, you might be talking about big policy issues like recruiting teachers on merit, but you might also be talking about quite micro things like the fact that maybe teachers aren't getting enough support because the female district inspectors can't get to the schools because they don't have money for transport, or they won't get on the back of a bodder and they need a little bit more. You know, there's lots of different, very context specific obstacles along any type of pathway to institutionalizing anything, be it led by government or anyone else. Act on evidence is, of course, absolutely critical. That's making sure that, you know, government and partners have access to the best possible evidence to make choices. Rachel talked about that. And then learning and adapting, being able to have metrics in place, and I'll come to what those look like, have metrics in place so that you can learn, is this making an impact, but also so that you can course correct as you go along. There's no point waiting for 3 years to say, oh, sorry, it didn't work. We need to be able to have much more real-time information so that we can make decisions. So we then struggled a lot with all of this, and we're in very early stages of piloting this. So when it comes to can we share things, the answer is we are piloting at country level, we're getting feedback from country partners, we're refining our documents, and that's when they'll be shiny and ready to go. But we'll continue to do that, and that's an important piece. And that kind of then begins to speak to this whole issue of, you know, commonality versus context specific when you think about monitoring progress. We certainly have some commonality, but for very specific purposes. So at the very top end, we ask all of the countries where we work a series of questions around this, what's called the initial assessment, around things like volume, equity and efficiency of domestic financing, for example. But what's the purpose of that? The purpose is actually to find context-specific stretch conversations, not to say you've reached a benchmark or you haven't, but actually what's it going to take for you to move forward. And at the very far end, we have a results framework, which is very much focused on how is the partnership working, not how is specific intervention working. But in that middle piece is the really interesting piece, because that is very much around what's the conversation at country level, what's the compact that's being made at country level. You know, people talked about accountability between all of those partners around what they are going to do to move something forward, and how do you measure that, both at the, you know, the sector outcome level, obviously that's a fairly clear one, but also more at the performance level, the micro to the macro obstacles, and are we making progress on those? And I think a lot of the delivery approach thinking says have very few indicators, and as you begin to move them forward, you can change them. So very context specific. You know, the political pieces, some of the behavioural pieces. Our ministers say to us one of the biggest problems they have is donor fragmentation. That is a behaviour of donor partners at country level. They must be fully aligned with government priorities in order to enhance the impact of system reform. That's a direct quote. So that might be something that a partner, a grouping at country level might want to monitor. And then, of course, we'll monitor the grant success. So all those different levels. But I think the important piece with all of that is that the vast majority of that is very context specific.
Thanks. I'm going to modify our own process a little bit. As I started to say feared, but in fact, as I knew, time is flying on us, and I've got a whole series of questions I want to ask. So I'm going to, in a sense, tease the audience with some of the questions we're not going to get to, and because there's one I really do want to get to. We were going to talk a little bit about whether education and health were different from one another in this regard. I think that's an important conversation. I hope this working group will find its way back to that conversation. And we were also wanted to talk about what specifically, how this kind of data could fit into dialogue between donors and governments. Another place that I hope we will find our way back to. But I want to focus specifically on a question that I think is probably on a number of people's minds, including mine, which is that sometimes I fear that the donor voice, as well-intentioned as it may be, sometimes ends up being part of the problem instead of part of the solution. That the kind of metrics we have around projects, that who does the monitoring and evaluation, that the way this interrelates with governments and sometimes even donors with each other on this, to pick up on Joe's last point, actually not only doesn't move us ahead, it actually accidentally moves us in the wrong direction. And I'm wondering if you all will be as candid with the audience as you're willing to be about where you've seen that kind of projectized, donor-driven, or if not donor-driven, at least donor-financed activities really get in the way, and what thoughts you have or examples you have where it might have been or might be otherwise. Angela, let me start with you on this one.
Fantastic. And I completely agree with you, Larry, and something we've seen in so many of our countries that we support. I'll start with the fact that I'll talk about timelines, right? And the fact that there are perverse incentives on both ends, the donors and the governments, around meeting particular metrics and objectives, right? So what then happens is, one, the donor comes with this 5-year program, and they come with a project mentality to implement a program by government and say, okay, in 5 years' time, we want this kind of outcome linked to this kind of metrics that we're going to be tracking. And so then what you end up having is that then the government plays this trade-off of we need to report because it's an imperative, and so they might not actually spend time implementing what could have been better in the longer time because we have this short time frame to report within. And of course, on their own end as a government, they are working within political cycles that are 4 to 5 years long, and so those two timeline constraints reinforce each other and cause a vicious cycle. That's the first point. The second is funding. And I know many people say, oh, but donors give such a small portion of the budget. How is that even a problem, right? And I think we've talked about this, Larry, before, even as much as the contribution by the non-state players is quite minimal compared to what domestic funding can and has done. The truth is that, this funding is actually influencing the more flexible or discretionary aspects of the budget, right? So our government does have a lot of money. There's no player in a country that has more money than the government in that country, But the truth is the government has very many conflicting priorities. There are so many things that are constraining how they can use that money. Enter donor X with not so much money, but then that is fungible money, so to say. And so how the donor comes and approaches the government and actually frames the conversation around that money actually then influences how a government actually prioritizes. So I think that's the second point. The third aspect is language, right? And again, I just have to raise this issue around, some of the language that goes into assessing if something is working or not is really based on, conversations and experiences that are global, but the framing is very global north-centered, right? And I'll talk to you, Larry, 2-3 years ago, I heard about systems change and I was Googling, what's the systems change? Only to realize that I have been working in systems change almost my entire career, you understand? But then because this term has come from this area, and if you're not using that term in that particular way, and there's so many similar kind of terms, I just want to show that the language that is formed and stated then comes to influence the bigger pot of money, and the bigger conversation within the entire sector. So, this player who is very important, but not necessarily the majority player, is not only influencing the larger pot of money, but it's also influencing the larger language and frameworks and approach within that particular sector, which then, to the point that has been raised, then causes a lot of either misunderstanding, miscommunication, fragmentation of funding, and not the most optimal allocation of resources, limited resources that is by a government. So this one are my, yes, go ahead.
Angela, before I let you go on this issue, give me your best single idea for what could be done to help rectify some of the kinds of issues you're talking about.
I mean, fantastic. I'll use a lot of commas because you just want one idea, quite a few. The first one is, the first 1A is that, there needs to be better coordination and blending of funding. Now, I mean, we do innovative finance at the Financing Alliance, but I'm not talking about the private sector grant blending, but, like exactly what Co-Impact is doing, right? All these funders coming together and then aligning and saying, okay, great, these are the big picture items we want to drive. Let's align as donors so that when we are engaging a government, it's one united voice. I think what Joe said, it has been mentioned before, there's so much fragmentation of funding, and it's so unfortunate because not only is there underfunding, the little money that's in the system is so fragmented, the level of inefficiency is crazy. So there has to be coordination and blending and very frank conversation across those particular donors, right? Around what's the order of magnitude of money that people can give? What's the duration of those funds? How do we phase the funding on the donor end, so that on the front end, the government doesn't experience these funding cliffs, which then cause a lot of inefficiencies in the system. I think there also has to be frank conversations around the willingness and ability to absorb the trade-offs that happen with scaling up and institutionalization. Everyone believes that the best model is what is going to go to scale and is the one that's going to be fully adopted as is by the government. And the truth is, unfortunately, it's not always the case, right? And I think as partners and as donors, understanding that if institutionalization is a process, it means that maybe where a country is in its context at that phase, the bicycle is the best that they can do, but there is a roadmap. There is a plan to move from the bicycle to the motorcycle to the car. People see these fantastic, effective models in a very small district that they have funded as a donor, which is really, and I keep saying, the Rolls-Royce model, and they're like, this is what needs to go to scale. And it's so unfortunate, because then with that kind of approach and mindset, there's a lot of unrealistic expectation on the donor side, there's a lot of pressure on the government side, and then we lose in the middle, where whatever was meant to be scaled up is not scaled up to the extent to which it was meant to be very impactful. So I think frank conversations of saying, look, if this is going to go to scale and this is the cost per capita that the government can afford, what does that version look like, right? With a goal that over time, that version can improve. But it's not about you must scale up this particular model.
Let me use that to go to you, Joe, with the question. The kind of narrower version of the question I want to ask is, do you see things that donors can do that would actually both be consistent with the way these decisions are really made on the government side, and also that would incentivize the collection use of evidence on the government side to make their own choices as they go forward? On this side, it's not only do the metrics have a tendency to drift to the donor side, the consumption of the metrics tends to drift to the donor side also. So if you're trying to reverse that and say we're trying to basically move that conversation into the host country government setting, is there something that either has been done or that you think could be done? I'll ask you to be brief. I know it's a big question, but be brief on any thoughts you might have on that. Rachel, I'm going to ask you the same question.
Do I think it's possible? Look, absolutely. I mean, I've spoken about fragmentation. I think the other thing that doesn't always help is kind of cookie cutter approaches to policy development, M&E, etc. This adaptability is key, but I think Angela hit the nail on the head. Governments have very, very little discretionary financing once they've paid for teacher salaries. And so I think, donors have a lot to bring into that space, and we have to be quite humble about what's possible in every single environment. I mean, there are some environments where, quite frankly, where we work and we can bring quite big money in, where the most sensible thing we can do is keep the lights on, is to help build classrooms if that's what we need to do, or to do some of the, to get the textbooks rolled out, because that is what government is struggling to do. But in many cases, governments are really looking for something that is, that will help be more catalytic, will help them innovate and help them make these types of changes. So, is it possible? Absolutely. I think there's a sort of where the stars align piece. And that means working on government timeframes. That means, listening. That means making sure that you're not coming in with a set idea, but there's a real willingness to adapt, not just to adapt to a priority that's set up in a big document somewhere. That's easy, right? But to actually adapt to the specific obstacles in that country that they're trying to unblock in any given area, not bringing outside ones. And I guess my final point on this is we're talking about partnership, and we're talking about partnerships between government and external partners, but also I think somebody talked about co-financing, absolutely right, about bringing partners together so that they can move together with governments as well. And partnerships are messy and they're untidy and they take some courtship and they take some time. So, being willing to be in it for all the messiness and to work through all of those issues, I think probably that's a very unsophisticated way of saying, yes, absolutely, we can make these things work, but we have to be patient.
Rachel, on exactly that point, if you think about what you've learned in your own career and currently about what donors can do to help empower as opposed to cross-cut this kind of analytical and thoughtful consideration at the country level, what stands out for you?
So again, three things. I think the first, picking up from Joe's point, I think if we want to understand that messiness and be genuinely iterative and adaptive, we need to first make sure we have staffing cycles that aren't 1, 2, or 3 years long. So this is about relationships, it's about trust. So as donors, I think we need to get more serious about who we place in countries and how long they're posted for, and more serious about embedding kind of national staff who have the cultural and language skills as well. The second thing is, I think we need to start thinking about building and supporting governments who are asking for evidence type labs inside government. So JPAL has been supporting this. For example, we know the good example of Minedu Lab that Jaime Severa at the bank started when he was in Peru. And these sorts of national capability to both demand the evidence they want and to use it. So to be not just the consumers, but also the producers, with the relative building of the research academic sort of capability in country. And I think the final thing for me is there are still some tools that get used by donors that are linear and extractive. It was more than a decade ago that I had a book on inclusive aid that talked about log frames and how those can be used badly in the wrong way. And so I think it's again about all of us staying at the cutting edge and challenging how we use tools, because it's not just tools themselves, but it's about how they're implemented. Thanks, Larry.
And Varya, see if you can put into this conversation the role of private philanthropy. Because we've been talking mostly about official donors, kind of by implication. But at least in my opinion, there's some very unique contributions that private philanthropy can make. And again, like everything else, done wrong, it can become part of the problem. But in this case, I'm focusing on how it can become part of the solution to the issues we're talking about. What do you think about that?
Yeah, thanks, Larry. So yeah, let's not go into how it can be part of the problem. I think there's loads of examples of that out there. Maybe let me give you an example of my experience actually when I was on the other side. So I worked for a civil society organization in East Africa, and we were working in Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda. And what we managed to do was to have one strategy, one plan, one annual report, and we welcomed donors on board our vision, right? It wasn't that we really consciously avoided, and we managed to, for a range of reasons, to try to dance to too many donor tunes, because one is fiddling, one is playing the piano, the other one is doing whatever, and you as an organization in the middle are trying to kind of satisfy them all. And so what we as Co-Impact try to do is to give organization space and breathing room to actually figure out what is your vision. You're the one who sits there in the country, in the context, you have the relationships, you know what needs to be done. Figure out what it is that is going to work in this particular context, make a strategy out of it, 5, 6 years. I absolutely agree with the point about building relationships long-term on government timelines. All of these things are part of it. So we as funders, we need to get behind the vision of the people who know what they're doing, not pushing our vision. So our vision as Co-Impact is to be those that are kind of lifting from behind, right? And I think that's probably the single most important sort of a shift in mindset, if I want, and also letting go of some control. I think for a lot of donors, whether it's philanthropists or any other kind, it's about my portfolio. Here's what I've done, or here's what I've contributed to. I can add things up my way. And I think it's really important to start to let go of that and say, okay, what does the government of Zambia need to know and need to do? And how do they want to add things up? And how can I support them? So we could go into, we have things worked out in a greater amount of detail for how to put this into practice, but it's this shifting that I think is super important, and I think philanthropy can do if it wants to.
John, I know we're going on and coming a little close to our end, but if you got a question or two from the chat box you want to bring forward?
Yeah, I think there are a few chats that are trying to that are wrestling with like the sense that this is going to be messy and non-linear, but then like, how do we actually, do this in terms of being able to track institutionalization? And so maybe I'll pose this to Varya. I feel that as Co-Impact, at least compared to FCDO and to GPE, you invest in a smaller number of partnerships and have the ability to do that in like a deeper way. And so could you say a little bit about where you are, as the director of learning and M&E? You made I liked your opening comment where some of this is about the tacit relationships and access and things like that. But when you're trying to guide co-impact or guide some of your partners to be able to draw out for themselves about whether their theory of change of government taking full ownership of programs is on the right track, could you say a little bit about, I don't think you're handing them a log frame. so you say a little bit about like the types of questions you're asking or things that you've learned or that have you surprised you or that are leading indicators, even if it's not, of course, it's not going to be generalizable in every context. But I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll try to be brief on this because it's a super interesting topic that I could go on. But maybe start by saying that our focus is on working with program partners to first sort of unpack and understand what is the problem that they're trying to address. And then on the back of that, articulating what I mentioned earlier, which are system level outcomes. So quite specifically asking if this system were to perform this particular function better, if children were to learn more, which means, for example, that teachers would have to have a certain methodology or be paid, whatever it is within the system, right? To articulate that vision, right? What it looks like, and quite specifically. And there is that time dimension as well. I think that a number of people brought out is that we're saying, well, you can, kind of think about your vision, kind of the blue sky, 10, 15, 20 years down the line, but then within 5 years, what do you think is possible, right? And to try to describe that to some level of detail, right? And so that then we come to an agreement of what they expect that are system level outcomes. And then we try to leave a lot of leeway to think about, well, how will the process of getting there look like over these 5 years? And we've had, to be honest, a lot of internal discussion about, can we plot these things out? Some people are very much fans of like year 1, tell me what's going to happen, year 2, tell me what's going to happen. And others are saying, look, I have a sense of what needs to happen and I need to navigate. And so I think we need to have a lot of appetite to say, and I think people talked about this, it's a circular thing, or it's a spiral rather, if you want to think of it that way, right? So things will go well in some cases, things will not go well, the context will change, things will happen to where you need to be able to, and here the concept of like relationships is super important. To where you have a relationship with your program partner, you can come back together and say, look, I thought I would be here in year 2, but I'm actually somewhere entirely different on this particular metric. And this means I need to either change strategy or adjust my metric. And I'm deliberately not being specific because I think what's really important is that you set the vision, that you agree on what needs to be changed, but the pathway of getting there has to be a continuous dialogue. So let me stop there.
Hey, John, I hate to do this, but we started in fact, about 10 minutes late, but I think we still need to end on time because we're going to lose people at that time. So I want to give the panelists a chance to make a closing statement if they like. And that sounds too formal, but just to say one last thing if they would like. And then I have a plug I want to put in before I hand back to you to formally close. Varya, since you're on camera, is there something else you'd like to say as kind of a final thought about the subject at hand?
Thank you. Maybe just to say, really, it's about finding people who you can align with and whose vision you can support, letting go a lot of the control that we usually try to have, and lead with empathy. I mean, this is hard work and people are trying. So, yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. Angela.
Yeah, for me, I would just, like to emphasize that, funder priorities may be better actualized if the ecosystem for success is identified, understood, and actually facilitated. And so in as much as you may have a narrow focus and priority, you need to understand that, especially for systems change, so many things outside that small control will influence your success. So what is your role in that ecosystem? And how do you partner with others to make sure that ecosystem is conducive?
Thanks. Rachel.
I think the takeaways for me are that we all need to coordinate better and stand behind national government strategies and plans where possible, ensuring that those are really evidence-based. And I think there's a wonderful opportunities to do that. We had at the recent global summit hosted by GP and the UK, there were some fantastic leaders such as Minister Senge from Sierra Leone, who are taking control and who are making sure that players stand behind their national plans. And I think if we can help connect up those leaders so they talk to each other more, that will also help make sure we're also in line.
Mr. Senge, by the way, would have been a great participant in this conversation. Joe?
I suppose, given there's many people on this call, I think, who've had incredibly rich and very, very good experience in finding solutions around different problems in education. And I think my request is, you know, the question is not how do I take this thing, this evidence that I have that is so rich to scale, so much as what is the problem that the government and its partners are trying to solve, and how can I bring relevant evidence to help with that pathway? And if your evidence is not relevant, then it's not relevant. But the chances are that there is very relevant evidence. And, you know, in partnership with government, it is possible to bring that evidence, but very specifically to what is the pathway this government is trying to move along.
Thanks. Just before I hand back to you, John, for a closing, I want to say a couple of things. One is that the community of practice as a whole is undertaking a couple of pieces of work that might be both relevant and interesting to some of you. One is that we've been looking at this issue of the relationship between systems change and scaling. And we've tried to array things that come in with a narrow intervention that they're trying to scale and how that relates to the system and people who are entering with the system, but it has implications for interventions. And to try to narrow the gap so it doesn't feel quite so much like I'm from Mars and you're from Venus in that discussion. We've got a couple of papers now on this. We've got a stream of inquiry going on. We invite any of you who are interested to join that. Another thing that we're working on, we're earlier in this process, is how mainstreaming of a scaling agenda takes place within donor organizations. And we've worked with several donor organizations on that. We're trying to sharpen what we think we've learned, but also try to move that forward. Again, people who are interested, please come join us on this. The third is the one we're talking about today, which is this issue of institutionalization or incorporation of change practices or new methodologies within the ongoing national systems. John and I are quite committed to trying to take this as far as we can. This is one step along that way. We're going to try to pull together some thought products. We're going to keep going with this until we run out of juice on this. I want to repeat the request. Any of you who are working on this and who have things that you think might be of interest, please send it to us. And equally, please join us. If you're not members of the community, just make yourself. It takes 1 second on the website to join. It doesn't cost anything. And would really like to have your voices as part of the discussion. I want to give a huge vote of thanks. I'm not surprised, but I am really pleased with the conversation that the 6 of us had today. I'm sorry we didn't have more time for questions from the audience. If you have those, please feel free to send them too, because we're not done. John, back to you.
Great, thanks, Larry, and thanks so much to our panelists. This was, you know, knew it was going to be a star-studded panel, and I was just deeply impressed by the insights that have been shared by Angela, by Joe, by Rachel, and by Varia. So thank you for taking the time. As Larry said, this is our 3rd session on institutionalization, and our 4th one will be on October 29th. It's going to be featuring the perspective of government. So we'll have one speaker who used to run the Indian National Rural Health Mission. We should have a second education speaker from the government of Botswana. So if you do know of speakers that would be good on this topic, please do shoot me an email, because we're just finalizing that. It's probably my easiest email address to use is my last name, Floretta, Floretta @mit.edu. As Larry said, on November 8th and November 17th in our annual community of practice meetings. We're going to be pushing on this theme of institutionalization and systems change further, and you can register for those events on the community of practice website. And we're going to be working on a few thought pieces that try to bring these inputs that we had from our 4 panelists today and the other sessions together. So this is an area that we're going to be at least trying to consolidate, the different inputs we're getting and share them back with the broader community. But I'll stop there. And thanks again for our panelists. Thank you, Larry, for doing a wonderful job moderating. And we look forward to continuing to be in touch on this topic through the community of practice. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Lauren. Thanks, John.